When Genshin Impact released in 2020, it was originally met with a ton of criticism, with accusations like they stole everything from The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, or it's just an anime Breath of the Wild clone. And honestly, a lot of these accusations had some merit. At first glance, this game really did look like it wasn't even trying to be its own thing. That is until you get to Genshin Impact's defining feature, the design choice that really separated it from the mold and made it what it is today. That being the elemental reaction system. This system was perfect for all kinds of players to have fun. It was so simple to understand that children could pick it up no problem, yet it had so much depth to it that an older audience could still make meaningful choices that allowed them to deal crazy amounts of damage. This cleverly implemented reaction system has had plenty of time to evolve over the years Genshin has been alive. So I want to take a retrospective look on these elements and look back and really see how far each of these elements have come. So in this mini-series, I'll be going over each individual element and what state it was in during Genshin's 1.0 launch, all the way to the current release of Natlan in 5.0. As well as how each character of the element shaped its place in the meta today. Starting with my personal favorite element, Hydro. I'm going to start off by saying, in my opinion, Hydro is the strongest and most vital element in the game. When looking at Hydro in its current state, there's no arguing how integral it is to the meta today. But was it always like this? First, we should talk about all the reactions Hydro could be used in at launch. We had Pyro and Hydro creating Vaporize, Cryo and Hydro creating Freeze, Electro and Hydro creating Electrocharged, and then of course the Geo and Anemo reactions. The important thing to note here though, is how Vaporize and Freeze were the dominating reactions in the start of 1.0, both being Hydro-based reactions. It's safe to say that even in the earliest stages of Genshin Impact, Hydro is an absolute integral part of the meta. With that being said, how did each character contribute to the overall value of Hydro? Let's look back at the roster of Hydro characters on launch. Barbara, Xingqiu, and Mona. At launch, there were 4 primary healers in the game, 2 4-stars and 2 5-stars. One of those 4-stars being Barbara. She had the ability to not only heal the entire party with her elemental burst, but to also apply Hydro and AoE around the active party member while healing them over time. This made her extremely valuable in many Vaporize and Freeze teams, acting as both a sustain and an off-field applicator. Then we had Xingqiu. This one is actually a pretty funny story since everyone knows Xingqiu today as one of the best 4-stars in the game. But can you believe that in the earliest stages of the game, before everyone really understood how the game worked, everyone thought this character was mid? It's hard to believe since even today he is an incredibly strong option in so many teams. His strength lies within his elemental burst, which allows for insane amounts of Hydro application and damage while off-field, really opening up the possibility for Vaporize and Freeze teams to take shape. Lastly, we have Mona, the standard banner 5-star. Mona is an oddity in Genshin's meta. Her specialty is so niche that back in the day you either loved her or you just simply didn't. Her biggest strength wasn't in her subpar Hydro application, but in the fact that her burst added a debuff to enemies which made them take increased damage. Now back at launch, this was pretty huge since a lot of the meta back then involved one-shotting the enemy. And the combination of Bennett, Sucrose, and Mona made the term damage per screenshot come to life. Using these 3 characters properly allowed for enormous instances of damage in a very short window of time. This team even today is used in damage showcases just to see how big of a number you can actually get. However, the biggest thing Hydro was actually missing was a proper DPS. And naturally, the very first patch in Genshin Impact dropped the exact character Hydro mains were asking for. Childe, or Tartaglia. Tartaglia, however, was a very mixed reception in the community. Everyone loved how his kit was designed, being able to swap between melee and ranged combat. He even had a different burst for which state he was in. However, building a team around him was very suboptimal. He didn't really fit perfectly with Freeze or Vaporize. Since Freeze didn't really bring much other than crowd control for him, and the only character he could easily vaporize with was Xiangling, and even then, he enabled her to vaporize, not him. For those who stuck it out with him, however, he made an excellent driver for what became known as Childe Taser, where he was the best utilizer of the electrocharged reaction. But this is where Hydro got kinda weird. If we look at the Hydro Resonance, it gives a large buff to HP percent if you have at least 2 Hydro in your team. But the only current Hydro character that really used HP to scale with was Barbara. Did Hydro have an identity crisis? It sure seemed like it did. Even if it was performing well, was it performing correctly? Move forward a few patches and we got characters like Hu Tao and Ganyu, the 2 strongest hypercarry characters in the game at this point. However, what really made them so powerful? Although they had a few other niche teams, they're both perfect masters for the Vaporize and Freeze reactions respectively. Both these characters on their own were strong, but there was no question that Hydro made them truly reach their limits, truly solidifying Hydro as a top tier element in all of 1.0. It wouldn't be until 2.1 that we receive our next Hydro character, that being Kokomi. Kokomi, just like Tartaglia, was met with a large amount of criticism as well. Not only was she another Hydro healer, but her burst allowed her to act as a sort of pseudo DPS character, but even then she couldn't even crit since her passive gave her minus 100% crit rate in exchange for a healing potential. And the community absolutely hated this. But once again, the community just didn't really understand her yet, and they would later find a multitude of uses for her. However, all of that aside, Kokomi was an outstanding healer and was actually very useful for freeze teams, actually being a very good buff to ongoing Ganyu and Ayaka teams. However, we still didn't have much as far as a Hydro DPS goes. Furthermore, Hydro Resonance still seems so awkward and only really helped the HP scaling healers. However, in patch 2.6 this would change, with the release of Kamisato Ayato. Ayato was our first Hydro DPS that scaled with HP %, allowing us to finally have a Hydro DPS that could use the Hydro Resonance. However, he still wasn't really able to use the vaporize reaction for himself, making him far from incredible. Hydro was just kind of stagnating. It was still a top tier choice, but nothing was really changing for it. It was basically run freeze or support a pyro character. And with the release of Yelan, not much of that changed. The biggest excitement when it came to Yelan's release wasn't that the meta had shifted or Hydro found a new purpose, it was quite simply that 2 was in fact better than 1. Since her kit was just a 5-star version of Xingqiu's, it became quickly optimal for most Diluc and Hu Tao players to just run both. It was so much off-field Hydro application and damage, there was no good reason not to. Something really needed to shake up not only Hydro, but honestly Genshin as a whole. The game was plagued by the same optimal teams for 2 whole expansions, and nothing was really changing. People were starting to get bored. And with the release of 3.0, all of our prayers were answered. With the release of Dendro, not only did Genshin finally start to feel like a complete game mechanically, but the meta itself got entirely altered from the state that we knew it. Given the way that Dendro was implemented, it changed Hydro around to finally get the excitement it truly deserved. Remember how I said earlier that Hydro was the base element for pretty well all of the top tier reactions? Well, the primary feature of Dendro is when it reacts with Hydro, it creates blooms. And let me tell you, when Dendro released, hyperbloom was insane. It was absolutely free damage. Not only that, our current Hydro DPSs being Ayato and Tartaglia finally found a home. Both of these guys are some of the best drivers for a hyperbloom or burgeon team still today. Dendro had changed not only Hydro, but Genshin as a whole forever. Fast forward to the release of Candace in 3.1. Candace was such a strange experience. Maybe it was because she was a 4-star, or maybe they were scared of making another broken 4-star like Xingqiu, but Candace was probably the first flop Hydro had received. She didn't seem to really fit in anywhere with a Hydro element aside from HP scaling, and she never really found a home. I personally found this really sad since I think Candace is one of the best designs in the game. But hey, you can't win them all. And luckily the second phase banner of the same patch had Nilou. Nilou was an interesting case for Hydro and Dendro simultaneously. She created her own niche that involved a meta surrounding the basic bloom reaction. And since she only really functioned with Hydro and Dendro, new teams for Hydro evolved around that as well. Unfortunately, there'd be no more Hydro characters released during the Sumeru arc. However, there wasn't entirely a need for it at this point. Hydro was dominating the meta. You could still use Hydro for the strong vaporize and freeze teams, but now every bloom related team wanted Hydro as well. Besides that, other than finally being able to vaporize their own damage, what more did Hydro players want? Well, this is where Hydro goes from incredibly good to what the hell are you thinking, miHoYo? I'm serious, almost every Hydro character from this point on is absolutely insane. Patch 4.1 drops. We've all gotten used to Fontaine by this point, so they decide to release the first Hydro character from the Hydro Nation. They couldn't be too crazy, could they? Neuvilette had to have been a mistake. This guy single-handedly upped the power scaling and what it meant to be a hyper carry. He didn't care who was on his team, he would just Hydro cannon all of the enemies to death. Additionally, miHoYo had made it clear, they decided all Hydro characters from this point on will scale with HP. Neuvilette absolutely took over the meta, with no shortages of videos of him soloing the Abyss. But in case you really liked Hydro taking the support role, don't worry, they wouldn't leave you hanging. The very next patch they released Furina, the Hydro Archon. And I honestly don't understand how this character was released so omnipotent. Now, Furina couldn't be a main DPS like Neuvilette, at least without C6. But don't worry, she would do more than enough damage while off-field while simultaneously buffing team-wide damage and healing. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, she could be played as a healer as well and could freely swap between a healer and sub-DPS at will. Sure, she has the excuse of being an Archon, so I guess it's okay, but man, miHoYo needs to chill. And chill they did with the release of Sigewinne. There isn't too much to say about Sigewinne. She was another Hydro healer, but she could also deal a decent burst of damage with her elemental burst. She wasn't very groundbreaking at all or exciting for the Hydro scene. And now we're finally here in Natlan with the release of Mualani. And I'm sure at this point you're all very familiar with Mualani. But coming from 1.0, it's actually kind of surreal to finally have a Hydro that can vaporize their own damage. And she's incredibly powerful because of it. It only took miHoYo 4 years. As you can see though, Hydro's had quite a journey to get to where it is today, and it continues to be the most valuable element in the game. And honestly, since Natlan seems to have this burn meta going on, Snezhnaya is almost certain to have a freeze or shatter meta, which will continue to keep Hydro still at the highest point of value in the game. And that's going to be it for an entire retrospective of the Hydro element. I hope you enjoyed this content, and if you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel. If this video does well enough, I'll continue the series through all of the elements, giving my full opinion on how they grew throughout the years as someone who's played since launch. Other than that, have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.